A very good afternoon to all of you, and my greetings to Shri Amitabh Kant, a very distinguished chief guest, Mr. Julian Prower of Dun Bradstreet, Dr. Arun Singh, Managing Director of SBI, Mr. Khara, other guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and of course, we meet at a time which I think all of us agree it's a very difficult year. It's a very difficult year for the world, difficult year for India, difficult year for the top Indian companies, and definitely a very difficult year for the government as well. In the modern era, we often use the term force majeure when we refer to contracts. Yeah. So, I mean, in an earlier era where perhaps there was less science and more religion, force majeure events were commonly called acts of God. And if ever there was an act of God, what's happened this year is one. But acts of God necessitate acts of government in response so that we can help those who are affected. And the government of India has taken this responsibility very seriously over the last few months. We have come up with a comprehensive package for the poor and the vulnerable. So I don't want to go into all the details, but let me just mention a few highlights. We've provided free food for 800 million people for 8 months. And that's 25 kilograms of food grains provided free to every vulnerable family in the country, to 800 million, which is much more than the number of poor people in India. We've also provided free cooking gas to 18 million households, and we've given cash transfers to 200 million women in the rural areas. In addition to these packages to support the vulnerable, we've been very conscious of the impact of the pandemic on businesses. There are a number of measures that the government has taken. One of them was mentioned repeatedly by the Managing Director of State Bank of India, which is the Guaranteed Emergency Line of Credit, which has made available 3 lakh crore rupees, which is $40 billion. And I remember when this was announced, there were a lot of skeptics who said, oh, you know, it's only one of those guarantee schemes, and we don't know how many people will actually avail of these loans. And those who are eligible have in fact availed of it. So it's been one of the ways that we have tried to keep businesses alive. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the details of all that the government of India has done. What I would like to do instead is, I think we should also look at the recent events in perspective. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed many more people than COVID-19 has done so far, and probably many more than COVID will kill even in the remaining months of the pandemic. There's still no vaccine for the Spanish flu. I mean, 100 years after it occurred. Nevertheless, while it was very serious in 1918, by approximately 1920, 1921, that was not the big story in the global economy. So I think we have to maintain a sense of perspective. Nature, civilization, mankind, governments, scientists have ways of responding to crises. It takes time, but I'm quite confident that eventually we will get out of this. So this is an event that has happened. It's a very serious event. It has set us back quite significantly, but we mustn't lose perspective. So yes, the world will change, and yes, some changes that happen may acquire permanence. But I would also say that many of the changes we are seeing will not be permanent, and many of these changes will reverse themselves. So the key, of course, is to predicting what will change permanently and what will actually be temporary. It's not very easy to do that. But from my point of view, for both the government and the private sector, our aim has to be twofold. One, we need to survive in the short run, and survive physically, economically, and figuratively. I mean, survival is the short-term priority. But after surviving, we also have to look at investing for the long term. And from the government point of view, that is absolutely vital. And it's precisely for that reason that in the Atmanirbhar Bharat package of government measures that was announced by the Union Finance Minister in May, we put as much, if not more, emphasis on the future, on investing for the future, creating the India of tomorrow, as on relief measures. So it was not a package that was focused solely on relief, even though there were a lot of relief measures. There were a lot of structural and economic reforms in that package, which are intended to put India on a new trajectory of growth once we get out of the pandemic. And I won't take a lot of time, but let me mention just two, which may be of interest to this audience. First, we've made sweeping reforms to agricultural marketing regulations. And today, it is possible for farmers in India to market produce anywhere in the country, online or offline, without any restrictions on their ability to obtain the best possible price. And this is expected to change rural incomes without necessarily changing rural output. It increases the share of the price that goes to the farmer and reduces the share that goes to middlemen. So this is something that has the potential to transform the rural economy in the coming years. That's one example. The second is a new policy on the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, in the sense that we've a new policy where we will decide which sectors are strategic or core, and in those sectors we will have public sector enterprises in the long term and for indefinitely, but the number of enterprises in those sectors will be few. So we will actually consolidate and not have more than a maximum of 4, and probably in the non-strategic sectors, there's a policy decision that the eventual destination for all public sector enterprises in the non-strategic sectors is privatization. And I'm using the word privatization, not the word disinvestment. And that's the word that the finance minister used in her announcement. And that in itself is significant. So I know we have very distinguished speakers to follow. So let me conclude by saying just this much, that we in the finance ministry think that the problems we face in the economy because of the pandemic are temporary. There are larger structural issues. We are seeking to address them. They are not temporary, but we're addressing them. So on the whole, we see a bright post-COVID future once the pandemic abates. And I think this is a good time for the top 500 companies in India to be looking at investment and a bright future. Thank you.